5 years ago today, if you can believe it, March 11th, 2020, life as we know it came to a standstill when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. Now, a new Pew Research study shows how Americans think about the pandemic looking back 5 years later. We're joined live by Alec Tyson, Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Great to be here.
You know, I took a look at the numbers in this polling, and some of your findings are really quite surprising. We were just talking in the break. I feel like so much of my life changed, and I still kind of ruminate on what took place and what happened, but the majority of Americans have kind of moved on with life.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do here is take stock of where folks are at. And 5 years later, the health threat for most folks is in the rearview mirror. Majorities say it's not something they really worry about day to day. But as you say, at the same time, when we ask folks, how did this impact you? 3/4 say it took a personal toll on them in their own life. And when they reflect back, they say 72% say that at the end of the day, they felt like it served to further divide us as a country.
Well, I want to dive into that a little bit because I think we really felt that during the pandemic, right? Depending on where you lived, there were different requirements. We're, showing face masks required right now on the screen. The vaccine then rolls out. There's different ideas about that. What are your numbers showing in terms of division?
Well, just as you say, we had some disagreements during the pandemic over things like activity restrictions or school closures or policies around the vaccine. And in some ways, we're still having those disagreements, or we don't agree today is one way to put it. When we ask folks to look back, were the level of activity restrictions in your own area, were they about right? Were there too many or too few? You really get a split view. And part of what fuels that split view is this partisan lens. Democrats, by and large, think the restrictions were about right, and their concern throughout the pandemic, among their top concerns, was community health, or how folks are doing with the vulnerable people in health. Republicans offer a different view. They feel more or less that these restrictions were too much in their community, and many of their concerns during the pandemic were around economic concerns or individual choice and individual freedom. So that's part of the story about why we don't have a consensus about what happened or how we're feeling today.
Well, this really does have lasting impacts too, right? There's been a lot of discussion even in this last presidential election that the hangover from COVID and these divisions kind of played into people's choices in terms of the election, but it also played in when it comes to media perception and how people got information about the pandemic and where they're getting their information. Can you dive into that a little?
Absolutely. And this was something that was true before the pandemic hit. You could say the information environment in this country had become more fragmented. Trust in government, trust in other institutions was lower. So that's the context at which this health emergency hit us. And in some ways, it helps explain some of the differences or disagreements we had. And as you say, absolutely, it was hard to know for some where to turn, who to trust. And the folks that they turned to may have been different for one group than another. And that's part of the story here, how hard it was to make sense of, they call it the novel coronavirus new. It was new for all of us. So knowing where to turn was a challenge, I think, across the country.
Were you able to look at the types of media and where people stood with that? I mean, I feel like the traditional media did take a hit along with a lot of these other government institutions that your numbers found. But is that true?
Well, two things are true here. One, folks turn to different sources, as you're suggesting. And the point that we do in our data, or we go into in our data, is folks' views are a bit different depending on who they turn to. If you were a conservative who turned to the Trump administration for information around COVID-19, you were more skeptical of the level of threat in some of the traditional news media. If you had a different viewpoint and you turned more towards print publications and maybe you lean more to the Democratic Party, you had a much different view of the level of threat. So it's a way of saying that, yes, the information environment is somewhat fragmented today, and where you turn to your information, it is connected to how you view things like COVID-19.
Well, Alec, we have to run, but I really appreciate you being here, and I hope people take a look at the numbers because there's more in here too about how people feel about the next health emergency, which people feel good about, which I was surprised by. So I hope people check out your research. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.